Hello, and welcome to Your IELTS Guide. This is a video series from Guided eLearning to introduce you to some tips, advice, and suggestions for the IELTS test. My name's Paddy, and this is my co-host Rebeca. We are both teachers and writers in the world of IELTS. In this episode, we'd like to introduce you to IELTS as a global test. We're going to talk about who takes IELTS, what are their reasons for taking IELTS, and how the test is run. Right, so Rebeca, I thought we should start by introducing ourselves. First of all, my name's Paddy. I'm an IELTS teacher, and also I work as the academic manager at Your IELTS, so helping to produce content and materials for IELTS test takers. But I've also been teaching since 2010, so about 15 years now, and I've been working in IELTS for a bit less than that at universities and language schools all over the world, places like Vietnam, Japan, Portugal, Belgium, and Spain. Rebeca, what about you? How long have you been working in IELTS?
Well, I've taught IELTS for 10 plus years in various contexts, working with different international students from universities, but also language schools like yourself. I'm currently based in Spain, but I've also worked in Poland and various places in the UK. And besides my work with guided e-learning as a writer and editor, I also write creatively. I've recently published a series collection called Stories of Hope.
Fantastic. So I think it's fair to say we're both pretty familiar with the world of IELTS. We've both been working a lot on projects related to content and mock tests and AI materials and AI feedback. So I think we're very inside that world. So I thought we should start by talking about IELTS as a global test and some of the reasons why people take it. I think it's something that a lot of people find themselves in a position where they suddenly have to take this test and they've been told they have to get this score and they're not exactly sure what the IELTS test is. So I thought it would be good to talk about what the IELTS test actually is. I think the main misunderstanding that people have about IELTS is that it is like a high school test that you pass or fail. I often get students asking me, what do I need to pass IELTS? And I think it's a misunderstanding of how IELTS works. The IELTS is a language level test. IELTS means the International English Language Testing System. It's a way of showing your level of English with an IELTS score. So that's the first sort of misunderstanding I want to correct. The score that you get at the end reflects your level of English. So for example, if you get a 7.5, that would show that you have a C1 level of English. If you get a 4.0, that would suggest maybe a low B1 level of English. And so the score that you need, if you need a 6.5, that's because the organization who asked you to get IELTS needs you to demonstrate that level of English language level. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about why people take IELTS, because I think there's lots of different reasons why people do it. The first one is visas. So if you're traveling for work or if you're looking to move somewhere as a student, often you need to take IELTS as a way of demonstrating your language level. That's usually for general training test takers. The other one is an institutional requirement. I think this is something both of us are very familiar with. It's universities and things like medical associations. Universities in countries like the UK and Australia and Canada will use IELTS as a means of testing your eligibility for entry into that organization. The second one is CV, resume. Some people use IELTS to demonstrate their level of English to employers. And the other one, which I find strange, but it's interesting, is people take IELTS as a personal challenge. I don't know, have you ever had any students do that?
Yes, the ones who like competing against themselves, if you know what I mean. So they just want to see where they are, how they can improve, set the next challenge for themselves. And I greatly admire that.
Definitely, yeah. I think it's it's a way of marking your progress through language. Those people will often understand that IELTS is, again, this level test. It shows I've come this far. I have achieved a C1 level of English. So one of the things that's important to understand when you're unfamiliar with IELTS or you're starting your studies is understanding that it's split into two types. There's academic IELTS and there's general training IELTS. Now, academic IELTS, the obvious word there is academic, which suggests it's more for universities. General training is for other purposes, but I'd like to be a bit more specific about what that means. So academic IELTS was created for student applications. It's mostly undergraduates and postgraduate degrees that people are applying for that require those scores. So for example, in the UK, if you're doing an undergraduate degree, it's usually in the sort of 6.5 area that universities are asking for, but it can be up to 7.5 for some organizations. For postgraduates, it can be higher as well. 7.0 is pretty normal. I think it's fair to say it's very rare that an academic IELTS test taker needs less than 5.5. I'm not sure if you've had that experience.
I would agree with that because universities need you to have the language skills to be able to cope with the demands of a course. So they would probably not accept something lower than that.
Yeah. I think the most important thing that a student can do is check what the requirements are of their course. Again, I often have students asking me, like, what do I need to come and study in the UK? And it's like, well, are you doing engineering? Are you doing linguistics? Are you doing philosophy? Are you coming to study arts, drama? It really massively depends. It also depends on the university as well. Universities have very different requirements depending on what they think is necessary to pass their course. It's not just the UK as well. You've got Australia, Canada, universities in America accept IELTS, many of them. So it's always worth checking what's needed. Also, another thing I mentioned was organisations like medical councils. So in the UK, you've got the General Medical Council, I think it is, requires academic IELTS rather than general training. So it's so important to check this stuff before you start taking the test because you don't want to book your IELTS test and realise you've taken the wrong one. So yeah, Absolutely. It's really important. So that takes us on to the general training test. I think like me, you've also had a few general training students.
Yes, but definitely not as many as academic ones, just because generally speaking, the academic test is more needed for the reasons that you explained. And secondly, because sometimes, let's say, an employer only needs their employee to be able to demonstrate that they can carry out a conversation with their coworkers. So for that reason only, I think it's sufficient to take the general training module, and some people will do that.
Definitely, yeah. I think it's closer to the kind of English you'd use in a working environment. For example, the academic test, you might have to describe a graph or a chart in writing task one. And is that relevant to most people's life every day in England? Probably not. So there is a reason for the separation of these two tests. The general training is accepted by visa authorities in countries like the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Canada, it's also used for things like residency permits. I think that's an interesting one because me and you were speaking about this earlier, and we were saying, well, most of our general training students are aiming for 4.0, 5.0, 5.5. But when it comes to Canada, people are often trying to maximize their points for the residency application. So those people are trying to score as high as possible. There are some organizations which again, you can use general training to register with, but again, it's always worth checking what's needed. And then there's a third kind, which is a bit confusing because it's not really a third kind. It's just another pathway to take IELTS, which is UKVI. Now, you can take UKVI academic, you can take UKVI general training. UKVI refers to the UK visas and immigration system. So if you are taking IELTS specifically for a UK visa, you would take UKVI IELTS. And the only difference is that the test centre is a bit more secure, which sounds strange because all test centres are secure, but I think the UKVI has an extra level of security that means it's accepted by visa authorities for places like Australia and the UK. So those are some of the reasons and the sort of the motivations for why people take IELTS. I think we also wanted to talk about in this first episode some of the misunderstandings that people have about IELTS. Rebecca?
Of course, there are several misunderstandings. One of them would be that IELTS is easier in a country as opposed to other countries. This is simply not true. IELTS is standardized worldwide. You have the same marking, the same difficulty level. And that's why you just need to focus on your preparation, on your practice, and not on the location of the test. Another misunderstanding that people have is that general training is much, much easier than the academic module. And this is partly true. Now, reading and writing task 1 are simpler in the general training module, but task 2 and speaking are marked at the same standard. Also, some people might think, well, if I don't know the answer, I might as well leave the answer blank. And this is a structural mistake because there's actually no penalty for wrong answers in listening and reading.
I think a lot of like teachers' tests around the world, they have a negative marking scheme. They don't like students guessing. Whereas in IELTS, guessing is like, it's a good thing. It's okay to guess. If you don't know the answer, guess.
Exactly. It's a strategy and you might as well use it. You might get the answer right through luck and that's all right. And then in terms of, let's say, a percentage of 70%, some candidates might say, well, band 7 means I need to get 70% correct answers. But IELTS bands are not a percentage. They're based on a score conversion table, which is quite precise. And to give you an example, in academic reading, band 7 would be around 30 marks out of 40. It wouldn't be exactly 28 marks or 32 marks. It just depends slightly on the test. And this leads me to also talking about some mistakes that people make before they take the exam as they start preparing. One of them is saying, well, I'm fluent already. I don't need a teacher. I don't need to know about the format of the exam. I don't really need to practice. And this might seem justified because as an advanced speaker, you might think just, well, I can self-study, I can skip coaching, I can just take the test. But it doesn't work. I'll make a comparison here. If you think of driving, you might be a good driver, but if you don't know the rules of driving in a certain place, you shouldn't attempt to take the driving test there because you'll fail. And it's the same in IELTS.
There's so many different skills in IELTS, and you might be a very strong speaker or very good at writing or really good at reading, but it's a very low probability that you will have all of the skills required for IELTS, even if you've been using English almost your whole life. Like, it's not guaranteed that you would be good at writing task 1 or the specific skills for reading, for sure.
I think you and I have seen this again and again, just a little bit of overconfidence that comes from this place of knowing English, but not really knowing the exam, unfortunately.
People get so angry when their writing score is low, and it's like, because there's very specific requirements they're looking for, and you being able to write, some English in a good way that's very creative doesn't necessarily translate to a high IELTS score.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. My creative writing, for instance, is so very different from the type of writing that's expected in IELTS. And that leads us to another misunderstanding. It would be about maybe doing too many practice tests to prepare, or only that, or not enough. So 2 extremes. And the first mistake affects you because you also need to develop general English skills, which can't really happen if you only focus on exam practice. And if you make the second mistake, which is not doing enough tests, then my guess is you won't be able to cope with the time pressure that's involved in the exam, right?
Definitely. I think students will often take IELTS once and then get a certain band score. Let's say they get 6.5 and they think, I need 7. And so they go, well, how can I improve 7? I just do lots and lots of practice tests until I reach 7. In some cases, that might be true. If your exam strategy was bad at the beginning, you can raise your score by half a band, maybe even a band, just by focusing on IELTS practice. But if you already had good exam strategy, raising your score by a band is very, very difficult just by doing practice, because as we said at the beginning, IELTS is a level test. It's a test of your level of English. And so you need to focus on vocabulary. You need to focus on grammar. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's just not realistic to try and do speaking practice just by looking at, let's say, speaking part 2 and constantly practicing that. It's not something that will help you with the overall exam or your overall speaking skills. And speaking of skills, now let's switch to something we call receptive skills. So this would mean the way we receive language, listening and reading. There's this idea that we should do IELTS practice the same way we do listening and reading in real life. And that's not accurate. For instance, when you read a novel, you enjoy it and read it at a leisurely pace. You focus on the storyline, the characters. Maybe you choose your favorite character. You predict what comes next. You try to relate the content to your own life, etc. And all that takes time you don't have in IELTS. In terms of listening, if you're listening to a radio program, you're not normally focused on catching words and phrases to fill gaps with. That's just not something you do. So it's about realizing that in IELTS, listening and reading, the experience will be completely different from real life, and also something that you might not expect.
Yeah, when you're watching a movie in English, you're not being quizzed constantly while you watch the movie of what word did that character specifically just say, or like what time are they meeting, or like which of these options is true about the character. It requires very targeted, focused listening, which is not something we do when we listen to podcasts or watch movies and so forth. And it's the same with reading. Like, how often are you quizzing yourself when you read an article, or as the example you gave of a novel, like you don't test yourself when you read a novel. So it's a very specific type of reading where you're super focused on specific information, and that takes practice. It's not an automatic skill.
Absolutely. And you need to have a certain level of stress to do well in IELTS, I believe. If you don't have it, if you're too relaxed, then you're just doing everything too slowly or ineffectively, probably.
But not too much stress.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about how to reduce that through preparation, right? And then I also want to talk about the mistake of avoiding speaking practice. I've had this, perhaps you as well, where students tell me, well, I'm saving my energy for the actual exam or for a mock test, so I won't really practice out loud. I'll just put my ideas on paper. I'll learn how to structure the answers I give in a certain speaking part. So the sounds that need to come out of their mouths in order to practice and to exercise the right muscles don't happen. And that's, again, a big mistake, because you need that mechanical practice to do well in speaking.
Definitely. I'm a very good French speaker in my head. But if you sit me in front of a person who speaks French, all of that disappears. And I think it's very easy to overestimate your language skills. You know, as teachers, it's our job to encourage people and motivate people, but also to give people a realistic understanding of their level. And if you're very good at talking English in your head, you need to be using it. Otherwise, your fluency is just not going to be there.
Agreed.
Definitely.
And I think this leads us into other questions on this topic. For example, how is the exam organized and run?
So the IELTS organization is made up of 3 bodies. In many of the countries that students are living in, they'll be familiar with maybe one of those bodies. So it might be the British Council, or it might be IDP. The British Council is a British organization which runs test centres and administers the test. IDP is an Australian organisation which does exactly the same thing. In some countries, you can book a test with IDP, or you can book a test with British Council. In some countries, it's only one or only the other. So those 2 organisations are in a group together with a third organisation, which is Cambridge University. Cambridge University Press. What Cambridge do is they are the academic side. So they research, develop, and publish the test content. And they're always like testing them to make sure they're the correct difficulty. They do lots of research to make sure it kind of is a accurate reflection of student level. They produce all the questions for the reading, writing, listening, and speaking.
Perhaps inspections as well?
Exactly. So there's a lot of cross-checking and monitoring, and because they have to make sure that the standards are maintained everywhere. It's like you said earlier, students often have a misunderstanding that maybe tests are easier in this country. But if that were true, then universities and government immigration departments would stop accepting IELTS. So they have to apply quite rigorous controls to this stuff. Otherwise, it would no longer be respected as an international test.
Absolutely. What about the difference between paper IELTS, computer IELTS, and online IELTS?
So if you're doing the paper-based test, you will turn up to a test center and they'll give you, for example, in the listening, they'll give you a question paper and an answer paper. So you can make notes on the question paper and then you can transfer your answers over to the answer paper at the end. Reading, likewise, you've got the text and the questions and you've got the answer paper. You're given time to fill out these things. The second type is the computer-based test. The computer-based test is the same content, but the difference is the method of answering involves selecting different options, dragging and dropping heading titles. And of course, instead of writing your answers where you're completing gaps, you'd be typing them onto a screen. The third one is the IELTS Online test, which is relatively recent. What IELTS Online does is it takes the computer-based test and allows you to take it at home. Probably worth mentioning, this is not available in all countries and it's not necessarily available for all test types. For example, UKVI, you can't do that online. The online test is also a type of test where it has very strict security controls. You have to kind of make sure you're in a room with no one interrupting you for like 3 hours. Make sure you've got nothing on your desk. They often, you have to do a scan of your room. Obviously, in order for this to be accepted as a secure test, they have to have like quite strict security protocols for this sort of thing. So it's important to familiarize yourself with what's required for each type of test. But the important thing to stress is that the content of the test is exactly the same. And I think many students, again, ask me questions about this. Which is easier? Which one is better for me? And the answer is, well, it depends on your familiarity with technology. If the internet connection in your house is terrible, don't do IELTS Online. If you don't use computers and you're not familiar with using a mouse or a keyboard, don't do IELTS on computer. Unfortunately, not all test types are offered in every test center, and some are not offered in certain countries. So you need to find out what's suitable for you. But yeah, the content is the same. That's the most important thing.
I know I would always do paper IELTS, even now in 2025, just because I like having paper in front of me and relying on my hands to spell something, to write something. But like you said, it does depend on how computer literate you are. Also, whether or not you actually like technology, because you might be great at using it, but if you hate the experience of using it, that will definitely affect maybe how you perform, how you feel about the test. You might get frustrated a bit more easily.
Definitely. I mean, students should try taking mock tests on the computer format. We have some on our website that you can take on a computer format, but also try, printing out some test materials and answering by hand and seeing if that is an efficient way for you to use your time. Also, these days, handwriting an essay, is that something we do often? I mean, when was the last time you wrote a large thing by hand? I mean, I don't really do it that much anymore. I write a shopping list by hand occasionally, but yeah. So I think there's certain skills which are dying out, and so they're being replaced by digital tools. It makes sense, yeah.
All right. Now, the final question to be answered here for our students would be, what happens after you take the IELTS test?
So after you take the IELTS test, you want your results as soon as possible. obviously. The amount of time it takes to get your results depends on the format that you've taken. So IELTS on paper is the longest. It takes 13 days or up to 13 days. It can be sooner. IELTS on computer is the fastest. It's somewhere in the region of, I think it's 1 to 5 days. I've known some students get their results the day after, but it's up to 5 days potentially. And then we have IELTS online, which is 6 to 8 days. That extra time is just to ensure the security of the test, essentially. Once you have your results, you'll either be delighted or disappointed, or maybe quite happy with your results. And hopefully that's enough for the organisation that's requested IELTS for you. You can use your certificate, forward it on to them. If you're using it for visa applications, you will have means of inputting the reference to the certificate online. In some cases, students may not be happy with certain results. This is inevitable. There's a couple of things you can do. You can retake the test. In many cases, that's probably what's necessary. If you don't get the score that's required, it means your English level isn't up there enough, or it means you need to do a bit more preparation for the IELTS test. You need to familiarise yourself. In some rare cases, it may be that your speaking or writing score you feel should be higher. You think your level or you think your performance was better in the test. So let's say you got 7 in listening, 7 in reading, 7 in speaking, but 6 in writing. And you're like, well, I'm pretty sure my writing level is higher than that. I'm pretty sure I did better in the test than that. So you can request a remark. This is called an EOR, or inquiry on results. It's worth mentioning that this does not guarantee an increased score. In many cases, it will not result in an increased score. You will pay for an EOR. If your score goes up, you get a refund on that money, but there is absolutely no guarantee you'll get that money back. In many cases, I hesitate to say most cases, it's probably not worth doing, because there is a large amount of monitoring, cross-checking, peer review of the examiners already. The request is essentially a secondary request for review. So consider carefully whether it's worth doing. It's not an automatic silver bullet that's going to improve your score. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind. Another option, which is not available for all test types, not available in all countries, is called the one skill retake. The one skill retake gives you the option to redo the test, but in only one of the skills. So if your reading score was a bit lower than everything else, you could just do reading again. But be very careful with this, because it may be that your university does not accept a one skill retake score. So double check with the organisation, double check with the university, double check with the visa department. Is it permitted to do one skill retake? If they don't mention anything, then the likelihood is that they do accept it. But if the university mentions we do not accept one skill retake, then of course you may have to retake the whole test again.
Right. It's like you said, always worth checking everything, what type of module you need, what results, etc.
Thank you for watching Your IELTS Guide. In the next episode, we are going to be talking about the structure of the IELTS test and the order that you take the different papers in. Remember that you can do more practice and study on the IELTS Ready Premium website. Thank you for watching.